All right, hello and welcome to Harvesting and Storing Vegetables from Your Garden, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Jackson County Master Gardeners. I am Spencer Ellis. I am an adult services librarian at the Medford Library. Thank you for joining today. Because we are on Zoom, we're going to be using the chat function for all questions. I ask that you type in questions as they come up, and then if it's like a technology related one, we'll try and address it right away. If it's more about the presentation, we will address it at the end. I will go ahead and read questions to Ronnie as we go, and then she will be able to respond. Before we get started, I'm going to do with the land acknowledgement. The land acknowledgement for Jackson County Library Services. JCLS acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, Tacoma, and Lotgawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the Indigenous people whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. I also just need to say that the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of JCLS. With that, the last thing I want to mention is that you should have received an email shortly before this program started with a handout related to the program. The handout is a review of the material that'll be presented today and is intended to be an option so you don't have to take notes. All of the information in the program will be on that handout as well as some more. And if you are watching this as a recording, feel free to email us at information@jcls.org requesting that handout, and we can always get to you later. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenter today, Ronnie.
Thank you very much, Spencer. And as Spencer just said, this talk that I'm giving is excerpted from a handout that I wrote back in 2021 called Harvesting Tips. And as he said, you don't need to take any notes as we go along because everything I'm saying and more will be in that document. And I want to call your attention to this little quotation from the Vegetable Gardener's Bible that says, "Far too often a harvest that should have been bountiful falls short of the goal right at the end." And that's because we may pick our produce that we so lovingly cared for too soon or too late, or we may not take proper care of it so that it can be stored properly. We might might harvest at a time when it's not as nutritious as it should be, or when it doesn't taste as good as it could. So that's why we're doing this little workshop, so that we do harvest at the very best time. And I'd like to mention also that many of these tips will be useful if you're buying produce at a farmer's market or grocery. It's possible that a lot of what I show you aren't things that you grow for yourself, but you can still wisely choose your produce when you are shopping for it, if you keep some of these in mind. So let's start with some of our favorite summertime vegetables. Tomatoes, of course, are probably everybody's favorite vegetable, and I've tried to highlight those that might be harvestable right now in the Rogue Valley, in mid-September in the Rogue Valley. Tomatoes should definitely be ripe right now. You want to pick them when they're bright and shiny and have a deep color. And these days, of course, tomato varieties can be almost any color: red, orange, yellow, even black varieties. So know what you're growing and pick them at the time when that color is vibrant. They should be slightly soft when you feel them with your fingers, and they should easily separate at the joint. And let me show you what I mean by that. You see here's the tomato vine, and then there's this little sort of extension for each one of the tomatoes. And right here is a little knobs, kind of like a knuckle on a finger. That's the joint where it should very easily separate when the tomato is ripe, as you see right here in this picture of the tomato that's already been separated. That's a little tip that not everybody is familiar with. After you pick your tomatoes, you don't want to refrigerate them. Supposedly they will taste a lot better if you don't refrigerate them. And you want to leave them on the counter stem side up, as you see again in this illustration. That helps to keep the moisture inside the tomato. And, you know, usually when they show them to you in the store, they're the other way up, because I think the flower side just looks prettier, but they will really keep better if you have them stem side up. Of course, to preserve them longer, you can can them or you can dry them. And I encourage you to get a current edition of a canning guide. Modern varieties of tomatoes are often non-acidic, and sometimes the older recipes for canning do not take that into account. Often these days you have to add something like vinegar to add to the acidity in order to can your tomatoes properly. And of course you can dry them. There are wonderful dehydrators that make that possible. If you're growing your tomatoes, in order to help ripen the last ones, about this time of year, just about a month before the first frost, you want to stop watering if you can, and then pick off all of the flowers and all of the small fruit that are still on your vines, leaving the bigger tomatoes, the ones that are close to being ripe. That will put all of the energy into ripening those last tomatoes. And there's not time to ripen those very small ones. So do pick them off at about this time of year. Excuse me while I have a drink of water. Now, if not all of your good-sized tomatoes have turned ripe by the time frost is on the way, do pick all of the green tomatoes that are still on the plant. Those fruits will ripen on your kitchen counter. They may not taste as good as the ones that ripened on the vine, but they should turn red and be pretty good. Just leave them in a single layer so they don't touch one another, and you don't have to keep them in the light. There are some varieties of tomatoes, like Long Keeper, that are bred to be picked when they're still green and then ripen indoors. And it may take as long as 3 months for them to ripen. So if you have those varieties, you may be able to eat ripe tomatoes at Christmas time. I'd mention also that if you have picked a lot of green tomatoes, not the ones that are going to that are like Long Keeper, bred to ripen over a long period. But you just have a lot of green tomatoes. There's lots of good recipes for using them. You can make chutneys, you can make relishes. My favorite thing to make is green tomato pie. Tastes like apple pie, really delicious. Peppers are in the same family as tomatoes, and the directions for harvest are pretty similar. But when you are growing them, pick off the first green peppers as soon as they reach usable size. This might help the rest of the fruit to grow faster. Of course, if you like green peppers like this one, do pick them and eat them, but they will actually have the best nutrition and the best flavor if you let them turn to whatever color it is they are supposed to be when they're mature. They might be red, orange, yellow, depending on the variety. So, like the tomatoes, pick off all of the flowers and small fruits in mid-September, and that will help the rest of them to ripen before frost. Sweet peppers freeze very well. You don't need to do anything to them. Cut them into whatever size pieces you want, chop them up, whatever you want, and put them in a freezer bag and put them in the freezer. Hot peppers are usually dry for storage. And so what you want to do is just pull those plants out of the ground and hang them upside down to finish ripening and then drying. Eggplant, again, the same family as tomatoes and peppers. So in mid-September, you're going to pick off all the flowers and small fruits. But for the ones that are ripe, you want to pick them when the skin is nice and shiny and smooth and they feel firm. Don't wait until they reach full size. They'll taste a lot better when they're just a little bit smaller. Cut them from the plant with your shears or scissors, leave a little bit of stem, and they may keep best on the counter, but they don't keep much longer than a few days sitting out on the counter, unlike tomatoes and probably peppers as well. Now, cucumbers, completely different family of vegetable. You want to harvest them as soon as they're big enough to use. Usually the smaller ones are more flavorful, but taste some, see at what stage they taste best to you. And you should keep picking them every day or every other day as soon as they get to that size that you like. That way they'll continue to produce more cucumbers every day. They'll keep in the refrigerator for a week or two, and if you want to make pickles or relishes out of them, you want to grow pickling types instead of slicers. This picture may illustrate the pickling types. What happened, the pickling ones usually have almost like little thorns on the outside of the skin. That's kind of how you can tell a pickling cucumber from a slicing cucumber. Sweet corn, maybe, again, everyone's favorite vegetable. If you are growing your own, or if you are buying them in a farmer's market or the grocery store, you want to make sure that the silk hanging out of the very end of the ear is nice and dry and brown. And if you grasp the outside of the ear and squeeze it a little bit, the ear should feel nice and full. And then you want to peel the husk back just a little bit. Just, let me see if I can get my cursor where I want it. Yeah, just peel this back a little bit so that you can see the kernels that are inside. And particularly if you're growing your own, cut into the kernel with your fingernail. The juice that comes out of that kernel should be milky, just a little bit white and like milk, not clear. If it's clear, it isn't ripe enough. And if it's thick, then it's overripe. You may not feel comfortable doing this if you're buying them in a market, but you certainly should be able to peel the husk back just a few inches in order to see the very end of the ear of corn. And it should look kind of like this. If the kernels at the end are developed but not really big, then it's probably at about the right point for best flavor. If those kernels at the end are really big, it's probably overripe, and you probably want to avoid that and try and find ears that are just a little bit younger, less mature, I should say. Usually you want to cook and eat those ears of corn the same day in order that they be the most sweet. But there are super sweet varieties now that will keep in the refrigerator for quite a few days. And if you've got an abundance of corn, then cut off the kernels and freeze them, or pressure can them, or use them in relish. There's lots of good corn relishes. When planting your corn, I'd like to make sure you know that you should plant your corn in blocks of at least 4 rows, not in single rows. The reason is that corn is wind pollinated, and the pollen goes from the tassels at the very top of the plant to the silk that will just be showing at the top of these ears. And each one of those silks connects to a potential kernel. And what those silks with the pollen that's landed on them are doing is fertilizing every one of those kernels. And you want the maximum pollination that you can get from by planting that corn in the blocks rather than in rows. You also want to keep the different varieties separated. You should keep those blocks of corn, if you're growing different varieties, separated by at least 75 feet, or separate them by what time of the season they are blooming. Make sure they're not blooming at the same time. Bloom means that there are tassels at the top and the beginning of the silks coming out of the ears. Green beans, you want to pick them daily. They mature pretty quickly as they grow from the flower. So you want to pick them when the pods are almost full, but not quite, and the seeds are still small inside. Try not to pick them when the leaves are wet. That can help spread disease. Keep those in the refrigerator for a few days. And of course, you can freeze them, you can pressure can them, or you can pickle them. Pickled green tomatoes are really good. So that's for fresh eating beans. Now, if you want to have dry beans to last all winter, you wait until those bean plants that have really yellowed, where about 90% of the leaves have yellowed and fallen off of the vines. And then shell the pods and make sure that the beans are fully dry. So you just kind of leave them to dry totally. If you're not able to wait for those leaves to yellow or fall off, maybe because rain is threatening or frost is coming, then just pull out those plants altogether and hang them up by the roots indoors until those plants have fully dried, and then you can shell them. Do freeze your beans for 2 weeks before you store them elsewhere in order to kill off any insects that may be on them. I spoke with a friend just the other day, and he said until he learned to freeze his dried beans, he was having insect damage. You would find holes in all of the beans. So follow that tip and freeze your beans after you have dried them out and before you store them longer. Summer squash, another favorite summer vegetable. Usually they taste best when they're baby size, but see what tastes best to you. Most of us don't like to see our zucchini get huge, although it's often the case that we don't see a zucchini plant or a zucchini fruit underneath those leaves, and they do get huge. And of course, then you can stuff them. And I have a wonderful recipe for a zucchini crisp that uses very, very mature squash. But usually you want to pick them when they're a lot younger and keep them in a plastic bag in the refrigerator for a week or two. Or you can shred your zucchini and freeze it to make zucchini bread later in the season, in the middle of the winter, whenever. The flowers are also edible, and there's a picture of a flower right here. You can pick off the male flowers, not all of them. You need to leave a few for pollination of the female flowers, but you can certainly pick quite a lot of the male flowers and cook them and eat them. They taste like squash. They're really delicious. You just saute them for a minute or two, and do that the same day that you pick them. And I want to show how to tell the difference between the male flowers and the female flowers. Right here is the little stem attaching that flower to the plant. And if the stem is long and narrow like this one, that is a male flower. That is the one that produces the pollen. But if what you see right here is not thin, but looks like a baby squash, if it's a zucchini, it will be zucchini shaped, long and narrow. If it is like a patty pan squash, it'll look like a teeny tiny patty pan. That is a female, and you don't want to pick that one, or you will never get any fruit from that blossom. So moving on to winter squash. Winter squash you want to leave on the vine until the fruit is fully mature. You test that by trying to pierce the rind with your fingernail. And hopefully you won't be able to pierce it, and that means it is ready to pick. Try and leave about an inch of stem on the fruit. That helps to hold the moisture in. You want most winter squash to cure for 7 to 10 days in the sun or indoors. That helps to harden the rind, and that will allow it to store longer. This is not necessary for delicata, acorn, or spaghetti squash, which are all part of a different species than some of the other winter squash. But for most winter squash, do let them cure, and there's no harm in doing it for delicata, acorn, or spaghetti. When they're growing, it's a good idea to try and place a board under the ripening fruit, and that may keep the dirt and mold and insect damage off of the fruit. And another thing to try doing is to wipe the fruit with a bleach solution, a 10% solution. That means 1 part of bleach to 9 parts of water, and that may help reduce the mold and allow them to store longer than otherwise. Pumpkins, similar to squash, wait until they've turned orange, or in some cases yellow. There's now all different colors of pumpkins, but you shouldn't be able to pierce the skin with your fingernail, but do harvest them before cold weather sets in. Try and leave 3 to 4 inches of stem on the pumpkins. So you want to be careful not to pick them up by the stem, because that's likely to break them off. And then they'll store quite a while at 55 to 70 degrees. Okay, moving on to Swiss chard. I like to roast Swiss chard and use either the small plants that I have to thin out to make room for the others to grow, or else the very smallest leaves. I like to use them raw in salad. But if you are going to cook them, all you need to do is harvest the outside leaves of the plant and leave the growing point, and they will just continue to grow throughout the season. That's a better idea than trying to harvest the entire plant. They'll store in the refrigerator for a few days, and they are very cold hardy. They'll likely overwinter, so you can just leave it to grow in your garden rather than harvesting the entire plant. At least that's true in the Rogue Valley. They'll start growing again in the early spring, and you can get another harvest out of them. And then they will bloom. They're what's called a biennial. They grow through one season and then blossom the second season and then die. So you will need to start new plants that during the beginning of the next season. Okra. I don't know how many of you like okra, and not everybody grows it, but I found it fun to grow and I really enjoyed eating them. You want to cut off the pods while they're still immature. They should be only about 2 to 3 inches. And again, this is a good tip if you're shopping in the farmer's market for okra. You want them to be pretty small, like the ones here. This one is really too long for good flavor and texture. They'll keep in the refrigerator only a few days. And let me give you another little cooking tip. A lot of people say they don't like okra because they find it slimy. If you cut off the stem right about here without slicing into the fruit itself, that kind of holds that sliminess, if we want to call it, inside the okra. So you might enjoy them more in that fashion. If you grow potatoes, I think most of us really love new potatoes. New freshly boiled potatoes are delicious. So while the plants are still growing, if you can gently poke your fingers into the hill as they're still growing and feel around to find those young potatoes without disturbing the plant, you just kind of ease them out of the hill. That's how you get the new potatoes. But if you're growing them for winter storage, you want to wait until the tops die off from frost, or frost is here and they still haven't died back. Cut the top of the plant off by hand, but leave the tubers in the ground for 2 weeks to cure. Hopefully your ground is dry at that point. That will help them dry the best and cure the best. And then dig them up in the cool morning hours. And of course, when you're digging, using your spading fork or whatever you like to use, kind of dig from the outside so as not to pierce those tomatoes as you're digging them up. You want to air dry them for a little while, either outdoors or under cover, and then store them in a cool, dry place. You'd want to keep them away from apples, because apples will cause the potatoes to sprout sooner than they should. Okay, let's go on to berries and melons. You want to pick the berries when they're fully ripe. And depending on what kind of berry it is, you may want to taste it and decide what the color and texture should be that denotes ripeness for that particular variety. And then eat them within a few days or freeze them. The best way to freeze them, except for blueberries, which are really easy, you just I like to wash them off first and then spread them on a towel and let them dry, and then just throw them into a freezer bag, and they don't cling together that way. But the way to prevent other berries from clinging together in the freezer bag is to first spread them on a cookie sheet, maybe with some like wax paper underneath so they don't actually stick to the cookie sheet, and then freeze them, and then separate them from the sheet while they're still frozen, and then put them in a freezer bag. Then they won't stick together in the freezer bag. You might want to dust them with any of these things, granulated sugar or vitamin C powder or pectin powder, and there are commercial products that combine all of these that will help preserve the nutrients in the berries. It's suggested that when you want to use them, you thaw them very quickly in the microwave, again, to keep them as firm as possible and preserve all the moisture and nutrients in them. Now, cantaloupe. It's easy to tell when cantaloupe are ready to pick. The skin tone changes, and really it's the netting that we look for. The netting should become very prominent as the cantaloupe ripens. And they slip right off the stem when they're fully ripe. They just fall off very easily, leaving a little indentation where the stem was attached. So if you're buying them in a grocery store or a farmer's market, be sure and look for that little indentation. That shows that it was picked when it was ripe. If you see anything other than this little indentation, like a little bit of stem left, pass that over for one that looks like this. I also like to sniff the stem end of the cantaloupe. If it's got a good fragrance, then it's probably nice and ripe and delicious. Try and pick them in the morning while it's still cool outside, and then chill your cantaloupe quickly. Watermelons, there's several ways to judge whether they are ready to harvest. The bottom of the fruit where it lies on the ground should be yellow rather than white or some other color. Should be nice and yellow. The tendril that's closest to the fruit, that's the little kind of stem-like thing, it should be dry and brown, and the skin should have turned a little bit dull rather than shiny. When you knock it with your hand, it should sound hollow. And best to leave an inch of stem on the watermelon for best storage. And again, pick in the morning while it's still cool. Now, other kinds of melons are more difficult to judge for ripeness. What I find is the best way to tell is that they have a strong and pleasant fragrance. I used to grow melons in my greenhouse, and I would look every day to try and tell if they were ripe. And then one day I would walk into the greenhouse and there would just be this lovely fragrance, and I would know, aha, now they are ripe. Other ways to tell: the leaf closest to where the fruit attaches to the vine should turn yellow. There may be a change in the skin tone, again, just a little bit dull, I suppose. The end of the fruit, the blossom end, may be a little bit soft. And then right around the stem, there may be a little bit of cracking. Those are all signs that your fruit is probably ripe. Again, pick in the morning if you can. Let's move on to salad greens. We all know that there is head lettuce and there is leaf lettuce. Leaf lettuce is easier to grow than head lettuce. It's also more nutritious. So I encourage you, if you're buying lettuce in the store or a farmer's market, do choose leaf lettuce. Particularly red leaf lettuce is the most nutritious of all. But if you like head lettuce, the way that you harvest it is by cutting off the entire plant right at the roots. You just get that entire head of lettuce at one time. But with leaf lettuce, there are 3 different ways that you can harvest it. You can do the same thing as with head lettuce. You can just cut it off at the roots. Or you can pick individual leaves from the outside and leave the rest of the plant to grow. That's usually my favorite way of doing it if I have it if I'm growing it in my garden. Or you can cut the leaves off, all of them, 1 or 2 inches above the ground like this, and new leaves will grow. And then you just pick those until the plant starts to bolt. Bolt means that it sends out buds and then flowers. And once it starts doing that, the lettuce will turn bitter and won't be nearly as tasty. To store your lettuce in the refrigerator, it's suggested that you soak it in very cold water for 10 minutes, getting off all the grit and dirt. Then dry it in a salad spinner or a towel, and then put it in a plastic bag. Squeeze out the air, punch a few little holes in it, and put it in your refrigerator. What I do is wrap my lettuce after I've dried it out as best I can, wrap it in some paper towels, and then put it in a plastic bag, and I find it keeps quite well in that fashion also. Endive and escarole can be harvested very much the same as we've talked about. This is meant to say, like leaf lettuce, you can pick the outer leaves a few at a time, or you can harvest the entire plant. Unlike the lettuce, it will continue to produce over the summer months, from spring to summer or fall to winter. Lettuce usually will produce for only about 3 weeks before it starts to bolt. There are cool weather lettuce and warm weather lettuce, but whatever kind it is, it will usually grow for only about 3 weeks or 4 weeks at the most. But endive and escarole will produce for several months, so it's a good crop to grow and add into your salads. You can blanch the inner leaves by tying the outer leaves if you think that the escarole or endive is too bitter for your taste. You can dig up the entire plant with some moist soil attached. And then if you have a root cellar, I don't know how many of us do these days, but you can store it that way for as much as 3 months. Spinach. Again, this is meant to say, as with leaf lettuce, you can pick the individual leaves from the outside of the plant, just a few at a time, or you can cut all of the leaves off an inch or 2 above the soil, the way I suggested with the leaf lettuce, and new ones will grow, or you can pull the entire plant when it's mature, but before it bolts. And then do the same thing as you do with lettuce, to wash it, dry it, store it in the refrigerator. Okay, let's move on to the cole crops, also known as the brassicas, and I'll explain what those are. It includes broccoli. If you're growing your own broccoli, you want to harvest it after this central head has formed, but before these flower buds, and that's what these are. These are buds of flowers. What you're eating when you eat broccoli is flowers plus the stems. So you want to cut it, harvest it before these flower buds open. And when you do that, try and cut this central head at a 45-degree angle. That helps the rain or water fall off of the stem, and that helps to prevent mold from growing. If you do that and then leave the rest of the plant growing, you'll find that side shoots will form. They'll be smaller than the big head that you harvested first, but they're still perfectly tasty and good to pick and to eat. You want to chill them as soon as they're harvested, and you do want to eat them within a few days. Broccoli seems to keep for a long time, but in fact, it loses its nutrition after only a few days. So try and eat it as soon as you can. Another cole crop or brassica is cabbage. There are early varieties and later varieties of cabbage. In all cases, the heads should feel solid when they're ready to harvest. Not soft, but nice and solid, so you know that the leaves have formed inside. The early varieties you want to harvest pretty quickly so that they don't split. The fall and the winter varieties will keep longer before you need to harvest them. What you should do then is just harvest them by pulling them right out of the ground and then cut off the roots. The early varieties will keep very nicely for 1 or 2 months. Later varieties for as long as 6 months if the temperature is cool and they've got some nice humidity. Cabbage is extremely nutritious and keeps for a long while. Kale and collards are the same family. Here again, you can just pick off the leaves a few at a time as you're wanting them. Pick them from the outside, leaving the growing tip on the inside, and the leaves will continue to grow and mature. They're very frost tolerant. They may overwinter, especially if you give them some protection like a plastic hoop cover. And then in the spring, they may start to form flower heads, sort of like broccoli. So pick those off and cook them like broccoli, and they will be very delicious. But then they will die in the early spring, right after they start to produce these flower heads. So you have to start over again within the next season. Okay, different kind of vegetable. Let's talk about root vegetables. Starting with beets. Beets usually taste best if you harvest them when they're still pretty small, somewhere between 1 inch and 3 inches. It's suggested that you twist off the green tops. We think that's to prevent bleeding, you know, that red juice that comes out of the beets. They won't bleed as much if you twist off the stems rather than cutting them off with scissors. The roots will keep for 4 to 5 months at a cool temperature and high humidity, but the greens keep only a few days in the refrigerator. I like to use baby beets, the greens from baby beets, and also the smallest leaves from the beets in salads. I think they are quite delicious when they're raw. But of course, you can also cook them just a few minutes with a little butter or oil. And again, they're very, very good. Carrots can be harvested starting just at finger size or as soon as they turn a bright color. And nowadays you can get carrots in all different colors. So whatever color it is they're supposed to be, it should be nice and bright when you harvest them. They taste best when they are small, but they actually give you better nutrition and will store better if they're more mature. So let them grow bigger if you want to keep them a while or you want the most nutrition. Here you can clip off the foliage about 1 inch above the root with your scissors. Put them in a plastic bag and keep them in the crisper drawer of your refrigerator or in a root cellar if you have one. In the Rogue Valley, because it doesn't, the ground doesn't freeze until pretty late. You can store them in the ground through those early freezers, and they supposedly will taste even sweeter after you've had a few frosts. You could also try mulching those carrots with straw to keep the ground from freezing and allow you to harvest them longer into the winter. Parsnips, again, will be sweetest after they've had a few frosts. So really wait until October and then throughout the winter for harvesting them. You could try covering them with straw mulch to keep the soil from freezing. And as long as the soil isn't frozen solid, you should be able to keep those, to harvest those parsnips by digging them. They're usually too solidly embedded in the soil to just pull them out, but use a spading fork to kind of lift them out, and then you can harvest them through much of the winter time. Store them in a bag in the refrigerator again, or in a root cellar if you have one. Turnips, another good root vegetable, also grown for both the greens and for the roots. Some of the varieties of turnips are actually grown just for the greens. You want to pick them when they're very young and still tender and cook them very quickly. The roots are best tasting when they're about 2 to 3 inches in diameter. Again, they will tolerate a lot of frost, and again, keep in the refrigerator for quite a while. Radishes. Now, radishes, the spring-grown radishes, so the ones that are usually red when they are mature, they mature very quickly, usually within 3 weeks to a month, and you have to harvest them very promptly. Although, one thing you can do is to leave a few of them to bolt. Again, bolt means that they put up a stem with a flower head, a bud, and then they will actually open into a flower. But if you let them bolt just to the point where they reach that bud stage, you can eat those little pods, and they're very tasty. They taste like a nice spicy radish, quite good. Winter radishes, which is what this picture shows, they take longer to mature, and they can withstand a lot of frost, so you can leave them in the ground and pick them as you need them, in similar fashion to carrots and parsnips. Okay, moving along now to alliums. Alliums include garlic. Garlic is one of my very favorite things to grow. You plant them you plant the cloves in late fall, even into early winter, even into early December, as long as the ground hasn't frozen yet. And then you harvest them in July and August in the Rogue Valley. You want to wait for the tops of the garlic, those tall, thin leaves, to start to get brown, but you want to leave 3 to 4 green leaves on them. If those leaves are totally brown, it's the heads sort of fall apart. If you want to dig nice heads that look like this, you want to leave a few green leaves before you harvest them. And then you want to dry them off in a cool, shaded place for about 2 weeks. And then you can hang them by the stems in bundles, or you can cut off the stems the way has been done with these, and store them whether you hang them by their stems or you cut them off. You want to store them in a cool, dry location. Now, there's basically 2 kinds of garlic. There's soft neck garlic, and as it says, the stems are soft even after they have been dried, and they can be braided. When you see those long, beautiful braids of garlic, that is soft neck garlic that has been braided, and supposedly those will store for longer than hard neck garlic. But hard neck garlic has its advantages too. For one thing, you get 2 harvests from hard neck garlic. Hard neck garlic produce a flower bud on a curled stem about a month before the bulb is ready to dig. And this shows you what that flower bud, the stem for the flower bud, looks like. Kind of, this is where it grows, and what it is just a long green, like a flower bud, and at the very tip is the actual bud, and it's curled around when it first comes out of the head of garlic. It's kind of hard to spot, but look for them about a month before you think your garlic is going to be ready. And cut off what they're called scapes, or sometimes called garlic whistles. Cut them off, and they are absolutely delicious. You just chop up that flower bud and most of the stem too, and cook it in a little bit of oil, and use it the way you would use cloves of garlic in your cooking. You can also cook them in you know, when you do outdoor cooking on your grill with a little bit of olive oil, really, really tasty. And they'll store, those garlic scapes will store in your refrigerator in a plastic bag for a month or even longer. And then, of course, a month later, you get to harvest the entire head of garlic of the hardneck types. Do save your biggest and best cloves of your favorite garlic to replant in the fall. If you do that, you'll never have to buy garlic in the store again. And you will be growing, perpetuating the varieties that grow the very best in your garden. And each year your garlic will be better and better because you are replanting what grows the very best in your particular garden. Green onions. Onions, of course, are another kind of allium, and the green onions, otherwise called scallions or bunching onions, are the ones that we harvest when they're very mature, before the bulb has formed. And you could just pull these from the ground while they're still young, or you can cut off just a few of the outside leaves as they're growing and leave the rest of the plant to grow. Again, they're very cold tolerant. They will usually survive the winters without any protection. You'll be able to harvest them again in the spring, but then they will bolt and you will have to pull them all out and throw what you can't eat on your compost pile and start all over again with fresh seed. Storage onions. For those, you want to wait until they formed nice sized bulbs and the tops have begun to dry out, and then they will start to fall over. And when about half of those tops have fallen over, you just kind of push over the rest to allow them to mature. Wait about a week, and then you pull or dig up the bulbs, and then you let them cure for another week. And only at that point do you cut off the stalks, leaving 1 or 2 inches of the stem, and then store them in a dry and cool spot with good ventilation. And again, keep those away from apples and tomatoes. Apples give off an ethylene gas that causes the onions to sprout before they should. The sweet onions, like Walla Wallas, don't keep as long as the pungent types, so use those up pretty quickly. So let's talk about some other vegetables. Peas are an early spring crop. They just do not do well in the summertime. You want to pick snow peas just as soon as the pods firm, and this will be only a few days after the blossoms die. So you need to check them every day or at least every other day because they mature very, very quickly. And you want to harvest them just as soon as they feel firm. These peas inside should not be growing. You should just barely be able to see them. Similarly with snap peas and shelling peas, as soon as the pods fatten up and while the peas inside are still quite small, you want to harvest those. They'll keep for a few days in the refrigerator, or you can freeze them. Rhubarb is a perennial vegetable, one of the few perennials that we commonly grow in our gardens. You harvest them best by pulling up the stalks rather than cutting them off. Don't remove more than about half of these stems. And in fact, if you're growing rhubarb, if you have just put in a plant, you don't want to harvest any at all the first season. You want them to build up their reserves and develop into a nice mature plant. But once they're big enough to start harvesting, each year, don't harvest more than about half of the stems because you want to leave the rest of the plant to build up its reserves for the next season. I hope you realize that the leaves are poisonous to human beings, although the deer in my neighborhood ate the leaves as well as the stalks. I guess they don't poison the deer, but they sure can poison us. So just eat the leaves. Just eat the stems. Store them in the refrigerator for a few days, or you can chop them up and freeze them, or you can use them in jam. They sure make delicious jam, particularly combined with strawberries or raspberries. Let's talk briefly about herbs. Parsley, you can cut off the sprigs just as you need them without cutting off the entire plant. When you do that, be sure and cut them off all the way to the base of the stem. If you leave the stem on, the parsley plant thinks that that leaf is still growing and it won't put out more leaves. So you want to cut off that entire leaf right down to the base. And that way it will continue, the plant will continue producing more leaves. Or you can cut off the whole plant a little bit above the soil and it will grow new stems and leaves. Whatever you do, when you've got quite a lot of parsley, you can chop it up and just put it in a plastic container, put that in the freezer. It will keep very well for cooking later on. Parsley is very cold tolerant, will usually survive the winter without any protection. And then it will put out a very heavy growth in the spring, and you can harvest a lot of it. And then again, it will bolt. It's another one of those biennials that will bolt in the spring, and you need to replant early in the season for a new crop. Now, other kinds of herbs, for the very best flavor, you want to harvest those in the morning and before the flowers developed for good flavor. You can use your herbs fresh, or you can dry them by hanging them up for a couple of weeks in a nice dry and dark location, and then maybe crumble them up and put them in your spice rack. They can also be chopped up and mixed with a little bit of oil and frozen in small quantities. You know, those ice cube trays that produce really tiny ice cubes. That would be a good way to freeze them. Basil, of course, can be made into pesto, and the pesto is frozen. So I have covered a lot of vegetables, but there are more included in that handout that Spencer has sent you or will send you. There are other less commonly grown vegetables like Jerusalem artichokes and kohlrabi that I included in that handout. I love to grow Jerusalem artichokes. If you do it in a pot rather than in the ground, or you will never get rid of your Jerusalem artichokes. Just a offhand tip about those. Find out more in that handout. Also, if you'd like more information, I suggest you get a copy of the Garden Guide for the Rogue Valley year-round and month by month. It is produced by the Jackson County Master Gardener Association and the Oregon State University Extension Service. You can find that in the public library. There are copies, 16 copies available, at least there used to be. I hope they're still there. You can request them online, and like any other item in the catalog collection, pick it up at the branch that you specify and borrow that and read it. Or if you'd like your own personal copy, you can order it by mail by going to the Jackson County Master Gardener Association website. Click on shop on the upper right of the homepage and follow the directions. Costs about $20 for the book and then $5 to have it mailed to you. Or you can buy it at lots of locations throughout the Rogue Valley. Every Grange co-op sells them, and then in communities that don't have Grange co-ops, there are usually other locations where you can buy it. And now I will be happy to take any questions, comments, whatever I can do to help answer any issues that you might have, anything you're wondering about.
Excuse me while I don't unmute myself. Thank you, Ronnie. I'm going to ask a question or two while we give some time to type if there are any questions. I actually had two questions. One of them was about the watermelons. I remember you mentioned watermelons should be harvested with a bit of the stem on, and I was curious. I don't think I've ever heard of that before, and I've never seen a watermelon at the grocery store with a stem on. Is that something that's a relatively recent recommendation, or is that something that's not done in mass market options like the grocery store, or what's the difference there?
I suspect it's just not done in mass market operations, perhaps because when you're putting a whole lot of watermelons into a big container, they might sort of pierce one another, just scratch. But supposedly, if you're harvesting it yourself, it's good to leave the stem on. I think it's to help keep the moisture in.
That's kind of what I guessed, but that makes sense. Thank you. We
Sure.
also have an audience question. What are your some of your favorite ways to prepare or cook okra? It's one of the things you talked about that this person is not particularly familiar with.
Yes, the favorite thing that I like to do with okra, and it's really quick and easy. Chop up some onions, start to saute them in some olive oil over a low temperature in a frying pan. As I said, cut your okra so very close to where cut off the stem very close to where the okra fruit starts, but without actually cutting into it. And then start to stir fry the okra until it just begins to soften. Then chop up some tomatoes. Maybe add some hot pepper or pepper flakes. Perhaps add a little bit of water. Put a lid on your frying pan and let it simmer for about 15 minutes until that okra gets soft. Season it any way you like. You could add a little bit of chicken broth or vegetable broth instead of water to add a little bit more flavor. And I like also to add some salad shrimp to it, which I do at the very last minute because the salad shrimp is actually already cooked and all you need to do is warm it up. And then serve it over rice. And to me, that is a most delicious dish and very easy to prepare, very quick. A lot of people like to fry their okra, first putting it in cornmeal and then frying it. So I recommend, I still use real honest to God printed cookbooks, but I'm sure you can go online and find lots of other okra recipes. But I do suggest trying it. I think it's good. Oh, I had it just the other evening where I did chop it up and I used it in an Asian stir fry, just as, one other thing to add besides my onions and my red pepper and my carrot and, whatever else I threw into, eggplant I threw into a stir fry. And it was good that way too.
That all sounds really good. You're making me hungry. And I have another question as well. You mentioned that most people don't have cellars these days. I think that's probably likely. I also don't. What do you recommend for trying to extend shelf lives for things that would normally go in a cellar? Would you recommend the fridge, or does it really depend on the individual vegetable?
I did not have a root cellar when I lived in the Rogue Valley, but I did have a shed that stayed pretty cool in the winter time, so I often stored things in there. You may have a garage. An unheated garage would be a good place to keep things like winter squash and pumpkins and potatoes. So it depends on your circumstances. If you're in an apartment, probably the refrigerator is about the only storage area that you have, which will be cool enough.
That makes sense. Thank you. I'm going to give another minute in case there's any other questions that want to be typed in the chat. But other than that, I think we're about done for the day. Thank you so much, Ronnie. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we are all set for the day.